Every dispatcher working a single-track main line in the 1860s knew the same fear at his desk. Two trains were out there, somewhere on the same iron, running toward each other on a schedule he had written that morning in pencil. The eastbound was a freight, 2 hours late by the last word he had heard. The westbound was a passenger express, on time, on the same track, with the same rights to it, and the man at the desk, with his timetable open and his telegraph key cold under his hand, had no way of knowing where either train was at the moment he was thinking about them. He had a piece of paper that said where they were supposed to be. He did not have a way to see them, he did not have a way to stop them, and the section of track between the two trains was getting shorter every minute. This is the story of how American railroading found a way to put an eye on every mile of track and a way to tell every engineer, before he ever got there, whether the rail ahead of him was clear or already taken. The early American main line, through most of its first 3 decades, was operated almost entirely by timetable. A railroad's chief dispatcher published a schedule that assigned every regular train a specific track, a specific direction, and a specific window of time. As long as every train ran exactly on schedule, 2 trains could not occupy the same piece of track at the same moment because the timetable itself prevented it. The system worked on paper. The system did not work on the ground. Locomotives broke down, snow closed grades, loadings ran heavier than expected, and trains lost time on climbs. And the moment any train fell off its scheduled time, the assumption that the system rested on collapsed, and the railroad began running on the judgment of crews who could not see each other. When the telegraph reached the railroad in the 1850s, dispatchers gained a way to issue running orders to specific trains at specific stations. An operator in a small line-side office could hold a freight on a siding while a passenger train cleared past, then release the freight to continue. The system worked when every operator was awake, every key was reliable, and every order was repeated back correctly. It did not work in heavy weather when wires went down. It did not work at 3 in the morning when an operator nodded off in his chair. It did not work when an engineer misread a flimsy order in the dim light of his cab and assumed he had rights to a piece of track that another train was already moving onto. The cost of those failures was not abstract. Railroad accident reports from the 1860s and 1870s describe the same kind of wreck again and again. 2 trains meeting head-on at speed on single track, each crew having seen the other in the final seconds, neither able to stop in time on the brakes of the period. The Angola horror in New York in 1867, the Revere disaster in Massachusetts in 1871, the New Hamburg crash on the Hudson in 1871, all of them killed dozens of passengers and burned bodies beyond recognition in wooden cars heated by stoves and lit by oil lamps. The traveling public read each one in the morning papers and waited for the next. State legislatures held hearings. Insurance carriers raised rates. The railroads themselves understood, by the late 1860s, that the timetable and telegraph system could not safely scale to the volume of trains they were already running, much less to the volume the country was demanding of them. The country was demanding a great deal. Freight tonnage on American railroads roughly doubled between 1865 and 1880. Passenger traffic followed. Locomotive builders delivered heavier engines every year. The Transcontinental had been completed at Promontory Summit in 1869. New trunk lines were pushing across Pennsylvania and Ohio, down the Mississippi Valley, west through the Sierras. Every mile of new main line meant more trains running on schedules that could not absorb a single delay without putting 2 crews on a collision course. The system had outgrown the eyes of the men who were trying to manage it. The industry did not accept that problem without trying to solve it. Some lines doubled their main tracks where the traffic justified the cost, which eliminated head-on meetings on those segments, but did nothing for the hundreds of miles of single track that still carried both directions. Some lines built more sidings and shortened the distance between meeting points, which gave dispatchers more places to hold trains, but also multiplied the number of orders that had to be issued correctly every shift. Some lines hired more telegraph operators and built more line-side offices, but the wires still went down in storms, the keys still clicked late at night into ears that were not always listening, and the orders still depended on a chain of human judgment that broke at its weakest point. None of it solved the fundamental problem. Every one of those strategies was a way of managing the gap between where a train actually was and where the dispatcher believed it to be, rather than eliminating the gap. And on a long enough division with a heavy enough schedule, that gap would eventually open into the space between two locomotives running toward each other on the same iron. What the railroad needed was not a better order book. It was a way to ask the track itself whether it was already occupied. The first man to make the track answer that question was an Englishman named William Robert Sykes, working on the London, Chatham, and Dover Railway in the 1860s and 1870s. But the principle had been moving through railroad engineering on both sides of the Atlantic for some time. The breakthrough was the realization that a length of running rail could be used as part of an electrical circuit. If the two rails of a section of track were insulated at their ends, and a small battery was wired to one rail at one end and to the other rail at the other end, current would flow continuously through the loop. A relay sitting on that circuit would stay energized as long as the loop was unbroken. The instant a train rolled into the section, the steel wheels and steel axle of the locomotive would short the two rails together, draining the current away from the relay. The relay would drop, and anything wired to that relay, a signal, a bell, an indicator on a dispatcher's board, would change its state automatically, without any human being having seen the train at all. The track had become its own witness. The American engineer who turned that principle into a working continental system was William Robinson, who patented the closed-circuit track circuit in the United States in 1872. The closed circuit was the key idea. An open circuit, energized only when a train was present, could fail silently if a battery died or a wire broke, because the absence of current would look exactly like a clear track. A closed circuit, energized at all times when the section was clear, failed safe. Any battery failure, any broken wire, any rail that snapped under a passing train would drop the relay and force the signal protecting that section to display its most restrictive aspect. The system was built so that its own failures looked like occupancy. A line could only be called clear when every component on it was alive and working. That principle, fail-safe by design, was the philosophical foundation of every signal system that followed. The signal at the end of each block was the second half of the invention. Early American block signals were semaphores, a wooden or steel arm pivoting on a mast beside the track, raised to one position to indicate a clear block ahead, lowered to another to indicate the block was occupied. By night, the same mast carried colored oil lamps that showed the same information through colored lenses. Later versions replaced the oil lamps with electric bulbs and replaced the moving semaphore with a fixed array of colored lights: green for clear, yellow for approach, red for stop. The colors and shapes varied between railroads, but the underlying logic was identical. A single block of track, defined by the insulated joints at its ends, was either clear or occupied. The signal at the entrance to that block displayed the answer. The system that grew out of those two pieces, the track circuit and the wayside signal, was called automatic block signaling, and the word that mattered in the name was automatic. No dispatcher set the signal. No operator copied an order. The presence or absence of a train on the steel of the rail itself decided what the signal showed, and the signal showed it without anyone having to be awake at 3 a.m. to make it happen. The first installation in the United States is generally dated to 1871 on the Eastern Railroad of Massachusetts, in the immediate aftermath of the Revere disaster. Other lines followed through the 1870s and 1880s, slowly at first, then faster as the technology proved itself and as the cost of the components fell. The Pennsylvania Railroad, which had already become an early adopter of the Westinghouse air brake on its passenger service, was among the first major American lines to extend automatic block signaling across its main routes. By the 1890s, block signaling had become standard on most heavily traveled American main lines, and the engineer in the cab of a steam locomotive, where for 30 years he had been running on the dispatcher's word and his own caution, was now running on the steady evidence of the track ahead of him. Westinghouse, by then, had moved into the field directly. In 1881, he organized the Union Switch and Signal Company in Pittsburgh, building on the same instinct for centralized control that had produced the air brake a decade earlier. The same man who had given the engineer a way to stop every car of his own train was now giving the engineer a way to know, mile by mile, whether the track ahead of him was already taken. The two inventions were not coincidental. They were two halves of a single answer to the same question. How does a railroad keep two trains from finding each other on the same iron at the same moment? The cultural change inside the cab was as significant as the mechanical one. Before block signaling, an engineer ran by timetable and by trust. He trusted that the dispatcher had calculated correctly, that the operator at the last station had read the weather correctly, that the freight 3 divisions back was still where the morning's orders said it would be. He carried that trust at 50 miles an hour into curves where the sight distance was a few hundred yards. After block signaling, he ran by what he could see. The signal at the end of every block told him what the next block held, before he entered it, in time to stop. The train ahead of him was no longer a fact he had to take on someone else's word. The track itself was reporting it. The cost of the conversion was not small. Insulating the joints, laying the bond wires, installing the relays, building the line-side cases that housed the batteries, erecting the masts, training the maintainers. Every mile of automatic block territory had to be paid for, and the railroads that paid for it tended to be the ones with the heaviest passenger schedules, the ones that read the morning papers most carefully when a wreck made the front page. Freight-only lines and lightly traveled branches stayed on timetable and telegraph operation for decades. Some still operate that way today, in modern form, on subdivisions where the traffic does not justify the signal investment. But on the trunk lines, on the divisions where the heavy passenger trains and the long freights shared the same rails, automatic block signaling became the assumed condition of operation by the turn of the century. The accident pattern changed. Head-on collisions on signaled main lines did not disappear, because no system removes the possibility of human error entirely, but they became unusual rather than recurring. The wrecks that filled the morning papers in the 1870s, Angola, Revere, New Hamburg, the long monthly list of single-track meeting collisions, became the wrecks of a previous era. The accidents that replaced them in the headlines of the 1900s and 1910s were rear-end collisions, derailments, grade crossing collisions, different kinds of failures with different causes that would eventually call out their own inventions in response. Every signaling system that followed in the century after Robinson's patent, interlocking plants at junctions, centralized traffic control on whole divisions, cab signaling that brought the indication into the locomotive itself, the positive train control of our own era, assumed as its foundation the same closed-circuit, fail-safe logic that the track circuit had introduced in 1872. The track was a witness that did not sleep. The signal was a fact that did not lie. The engineer was no longer running on someone else's word. The block signal did not eliminate every danger on the railroad. It did not stop a brake from failing on a grade. It did not prevent an engineer from running past a red signal he had seen, or had not seen, or had misread in fog. It did not protect a passenger train from a track that had washed out between blocks, but it gave the man at the throttle something the timetable and the telegraph had never been able to give him: a way to know, before he ran into it, what was on the rail ahead. The signal masts that still stand beside main lines across the continent, blinking quietly through the night long after the last train has passed, are the descendants of that 1872 idea. They are doing exactly what they did when they were new. They are watching the track for the engineer who cannot.